Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Saturday, November 9th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, we check in on House races as the GOP nears control, plus how voters approached ballot issues this election, and what's next for higher education under a new Trump administration. Control of the House of Representatives remains up for grabs as the vote counting heads into the weekend in 24 pivotal U.S. House races. Both parties are hoping to seize the lower chamber for 2025, and it's a last chance at power for Democrats after Donald Trump claimed the White House while Republicans gained a majority in the Senate. It will take 218 seats to rule the House, and although neither party has reached the threshold, the numbers appear to favor the GOP. As of early this morning, Republicans held 211 seats to Democrats' 200, including 3 seats Republicans flipped from Democrats. You can follow along with the final House race counts on usatoday.com. And for a look at what full GOP control in Washington might mean next year, be sure to check out our Friday episode. Election Day 2024 gave voters across the U.S. an opportunity to vote not only for the presidency and lawmakers, but other contentious issues like abortion and reproductive care, marijuana, and LGBTQ+ rights. To learn more about what was on the ballot and how voters responded, I spoke with USA Today trending news reporter Kinsey Crowley. Kinsey, thanks for joining The Excerpt today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Kinsey, let's just start with what was on the ballot here and how Americans voted.
We had some protections on the ballot, both for LGBTQ rights and for reproductive rights. We saw a few states, California, Colorado, and Hawaii, pass same-sex marriage constitutional amendments for the state to protect that right. Now, that, of course, is federally legal, but this is a further protection at the state level. 10 states also had reproductive rights on the ballot, and in 7 of those states, the voters decided to pass in favor of further protecting rights for people who are looking for reproductive care. And lastly, we also reached a few milestones for LGBTQ representation in politics. Sarah McBride from Delaware will be the first openly trans person elected to federal office. Julie Johnson will be the first openly gay Texan voted to the U.S. House of Representatives. And in Montana State Legislature, Zoe Zephyr, who was censured last year for speaking out against her Republican colleagues, was reelected, and she will be returning to the House floor.
You know, Kinsey, the Trump-Vance campaign directed quite a bit of charged rhetoric at the LGBTQ+ community in the months leading up to this election. What kinds of things were you hearing from members of this community?
Some of my colleagues reported that crisis services for LGBTQ community has seen an uptick this week. And this is, of course, not only during election week. You know, there was a really popular ad attacking Kamala Harris for her past support of the trans community in doing something that was mandated by law. That ad played around football a lot. I reported on this story earlier that some trans people were seeing increased suicidality, increased hate crimes in areas where this rhetoric has been around for years now. And like I said, before the election, Trump has been touting one of his campaign promises, which is to, quote, keep men out of women's sports. And that was something that really became center stage during the Olympics this summer when Algerian boxer was misidentified as a trans woman. She's not a trans woman, but Trump did spread that misinformation as part of his campaign.
So, you mentioned these promises from Trump. President-elect Trump has promised to enact legislation to roll back rights specifically of the transgender community. What kinds of things did he promise to do?
He's promised to outlaw gender-affirming care for minors at the federal level. There are a lot of states that have already passed this locally. He's promised to ban for gender-affirming care for minors either through congressional law or through FDA direction. He's promised to cut funding for, quote, inclusive schools that promote critical race theory and sexual identity lessons. He also promised to direct Congress to pass a law to only recognize male and female, for example, in legal documents as they are assigned at birth. And lastly, to roll back Title IX protections for transgender students.
And Kinsey, are these things he can just sign executive orders to accomplish? It's hard to imagine Congress giving him carte blanche on this kind of legislation, even with GOP control on Capitol Hill, as we expect next year.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things would be difficult, if not impossible, to do by executive action. For example, passing a law to ban gender affirming care, he's going to need Congress buy-in to do that. With regards to directing the FDA, the FDA does not control how doctors use drugs. So, whatever FDA direction he gives for that would have broader implications. Cutting funding for schools would be extremely complicated. Again, passing laws to only recognize male and female as they are assigned at birth on legal documents, going to need congressional buy-in. By and large, if possible at all, they'd be very complicated or they need backing from Congress.
Great breakdown for us. Kinsey Crowley covers trending news for USA Today. Thank you, Kinsey.
Thanks so much for having me.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has congratulated President-elect Donald Trump on his election victory, calling him a courageous man. Russia's leader made the comments late Thursday during an event where he spoke for several hours in the Black Sea resort city of Sochi. Trump has repeatedly said he can end the war in Ukraine caused by Russia's unprovoked 2022 invasion in a day. He has not elaborated on how he could make that happen, but speculation has focused on whether he may seek to leverage Putin's oft-stated admiration in order to create some kind of peace deal. Putin's comments came after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Wednesday he spoke with Trump and congratulated him on his election win. Curiously, Elon Musk joined that phone call, raising questions about his potentially outsized role in the upcoming administration. Musk's appearance on the call was not coordinated, but he happened to walk into the room right as Trump and Zelensky were speaking, and the president-elect put him on the phone, according to a Wall Street Journal report. 3 men were charged yesterday in a murder-for-hire plot, including one accused of trying to kill President-elect Donald Trump in revenge for the death of a top Iranian military commander. That's according to a Justice Department announcement yesterday. Farhad Shakiri of Iran and Carlisle Rivera and Jonathan Lodeholt of New York were named in the indictment. Rivera and Lodeholt were each arrested Thursday in New York and were ordered held pending trial during an initial court appearance. Shakiri, who is charged with trying to kill Trump, remains at large and is believed to be in Iran. The charges allege Iran has been targeting U.S. citizens to take vengeance for the January 2020 death of Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who was killed by a drone strike in Baghdad on Trump's orders. Additionally, officials say Iran has targeted Trump personally with assassination plots and his campaign through hacking attempts as it sought to disrupt the 2024 presidential race. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. President-elect Trump's victory could spell the end of President Biden's higher education policies. I spoke with USA Today education reporter Zach Shermley for more. Zach, thank you for making some time, as always.
Thank you, Taylor.
So, Zach, just starting with this, what were some of the main focal points of the Biden administration when it came to education?
Joe Biden was pretty ambitious. I mean, he has prioritized a lot of different types of reforms to the American higher education system. There are some pieces of that we've heard more about than others. He authorized nearly $200 billion in debt cancellation for roughly 5 million Americans. He was also very adamant about addressing other parts of the variables that contribute to the high cost of a college degree. So his administration tried to really ramp up college oversight and rewrite lots of other regulations. Also under Biden, the federal education department handled more anti-discrimination complaints than ever before. And at the same time, they worked to rewrite rules to shore up the rights of victims of sexual misconduct and also to codify protections for queer and transgender students.
All right, well, let's shift to both the former president and president-elect, that's Donald Trump. What did we see from the last Trump administration on education, Zach? And what did we hear from Trump on the campaign trail ahead of this election win, really about some of his main education goals this time around?
So Donald Trump's 4 years in office took a very different approach. And needless to say, it was not a very high up priority for the Trump administration. Trump also enacted regulations that bolstered the rights of those accused of sexual misconduct on school campuses. His administration tried hard to streamline the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. And some critics have told me if Biden's team had just picked up on that work, then things would have gone a little bit smoother this last year. on that front. But in terms of what Trump is potentially looking at doing going forward, he's talked about firing what he calls radical left accreditors. Those are the oversight nonprofit groups that help make sure that colleges are being held accountable. He's talked about deporting pro-Hamas protesters and aggressively taxing rich universities too.
We've also heard comments about the education department writ large and maybe even getting rid of it entirely. Is this even possible? And might Trump actually lean into those claims?
Trump cannot unilaterally abolish the education department. That would take an act of Congress, where the balance of power is still starting to become clear here in Washington. So the GOP has retained control of the Senate. We know that for sure. It's looking increasingly likely they're going to have the House of Representatives as well. But even if Republicans grasp all the levers of power in the federal government, their margins are still going to be pretty slim on Capitol Hill. And that's a tricky political environment to pull off something like abolishing a longstanding federal agency.
Well, Zach, you mentioned some of the balances of power on Capitol Hill. Are there really counterbalances in place that could prevent Trump from carrying out, I guess, all of his education goals? What do experts say on this?
So there was this big Supreme Court case. I believe you and I talked about it, Taylor, actually at the time this summer, that could potentially curb his ability to enact some of the changes that he is likely going to seek. The bigger case had to do with something called Chevron deference, which is a legal precedent that for many years gave federal agencies like the Education Department broad authority to interpret laws written by Congress. The Supreme Court took that away, which makes every federal agency, including the Education Department, less powerful. Then there's also the fact that the Senate doesn't have a filibuster-proof majority. So that means it's still going to be relatively difficult to pass legislation, unless, of course, somehow the filibuster goes away.
Zach, you also wrote about the so-called diploma divide. I find this fascinating. It's really come through as one of the major narratives after this election. Can you talk us through that a little bit, how it shook out this election and what it might mean for some of these difficult upcoming conversations and debates around education?
So Democrats have long struggled with voters who never went to college, which is something that's kind of ironic because for a long time, the Democratic Party was the party of the working class, of the blue-collar union Democrat kind of a voter. Now they do much better among college-educated voters, and all indications are that that diploma divide has now gotten even wider. I think it's really fair to say that the American electorate has really been shaped dramatically, in fact, by the influence of the higher education system. Who goes to college? Who doesn't? What that means for economic opportunity and what the intellectualism that colleges stand for, and that a lot of conservatives nowadays sort of rebuke. The election results, I think, shined a spotlight on the partisan divide between Americans with college degrees and those without them. And though it is still pretty unclear what exactly President-elect Trump is going to be able to accomplish with another 4 years in the White House, he's likely going to capitalize on that support from non-college educated voters. And that's going to chart a very different path for America's universities. It's going to have really big implications for the millions and millions of Americans who do still see value in college and who still do go to college every year and see it as a part of their version of the American dream.
All right. Zach Shermley covers education for USA Today. I appreciate your breakdown here, as always. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Taylor.
Close to 7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's today. That number is expected to balloon to 13 million by 2050, which will put strains on families and the healthcare system. Dr. Joanne Pike, CEO of the Alzheimer's Association, joins me to help explain the challenges and hopes when it comes to this debilitating disease. Listen tomorrow morning on The Excerpt. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio. And if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.